guys. Today we're gonna go over something called a balance of payment. Balance balance of payment equations equation. And this is a very fundamental equation that basically describe or govern how a country's balance of payment work. Now imagine that you have a country, let's say Mexico, right? So this is a country, Mexico. Mexico, when it exports something, like let's say export goods like a car to the U.S. or services, maybe professional services or whatever services that Mexico export, um, that's considered part of Mexico's current account. So goods and services. This is considered Mexico's current account. So current account can be positive and it could be negative. So it could be goods and services exported if, and then there's also a financial account. Basically, this is about a country's, for example, if foreigners were to buy bonds and stocks uh, into the Mexican security markets, then that's positive capital flow. If if say Mexico export capital to, let's say Mexico buy stocks and bonds in other countries, then that's capital outflow. So this is capital account. This is financial flow, financial account. So this is part of the capital account. So if, let's say, foreigner Mexico were to buy U.S. bonds, right, or stocks, U.S. stocks, that's considered capital outflow, right? So there's a fundamental relationship between goods and services that a country import and export, and the financial activities or financial transactions of a country. If foreigners buy more Mexican assets like bonds and stocks, that's capital inflow. If Mexican government were to buy, let's say, U.S. stocks or securities, that's capital outflow. According to a fundamental equation that governs the dynamics of these kind of activities, is this capital account, which represents the trade balance, plus the financial account, equals to zero. This is a very powerful equation. So, take for example, let's suppose that a country X, right? If this country, let's say, have export more than it imports, then its capital. So let's say the goods are exported out on net. This country X export more than it imports, so its capital account is positive. But since its capital account is positive, it follows that its financial account must be negative. So FA must be negative. Financial financial flow is negative, so it's pointing outward. Okay, so similarly, I think this is kind of, in our world, a biggest export country is probably China or Japan or South Korea. For those countries, They on net export more goods and services than they import, so their capital account is positive. It follows by the balance of payment equation, their financial account has to be negative. So they are, in other words, exporting capital, their capital abroad. That means that in countries like China or Japan, what they do is they buy U.S. bonds or U.S. stocks, or real estate in other countries, or they buy other countries' companies. And this is considered a financial account, negative financial account, which means that they are exporting exporting their capital abroad. So their financial accounts is negative because they want to balance their capital account. So, and that's how they balance the equation. Capital account plus financial account equals 0. Now, another possibility is you can have a country Y, right? And for this country, it imports more than it exports. So its goods imports on net, or its current account is negative, right? It's so a example of a country where it imports more than it exports is like the United States, right? The United States have a trade imbalance or a trade deficit. That means that the United States import more goods than it export, so its current account is negative. But since we know that CA must be CA plus FA must be equal to 0, it follows that its financial account must be positive. What that means is that the financial inflow must be positive. And this means that foreigners are going to use that, it's going to buy, lend money or buy U.S. debt. Like think of foreigners buying. So FA is positive. It means that foreigners are buying domestic assets. This is an example in the real world would be the United States, right, and United Kingdom, right. Generally speaking, they are United States and United Kingdom are net deficit countries. In terms of trade balance, they're negative, but it's balanced by positive financial flow, which means that foreigners are buying U.S. debt or UK debt, right? So think about foreigners. So whenever you have a positive financial inflow, this means that, positive financial account means that there's positive financial inflow. That means that foreigners are buying U.S. bonds and stocks, right? Also known as treasury bills. So an example in real life, this would be China, Japan, Korea, right? South Korea, Taiwan. Example in real life of country Y would be the United States, the UK. So countries like China, they are export orientated. That means that their current account must be positive. But in order to have a positive financial account, their financial flow must be negative. That means that there is more outflow than inflow on net. So that means that their financial account is negative. For countries like the United States and UK, which is a net import country, like is a net negative trade deficit country, right? And so that means that their current account is less than 0. That means that their financial account is bigger than 0. That means that there's a net positive financial inflow, which means that foreigners are buying U.S. bonds and stocks. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about how international trade works. Suppose that you have two countries. Let's call it X and Y, right? Two countries, X and Y. So how does international trade work? Okay, so by the way, suppose that for that X and Y is not the U.S. or Europe. Suppose that X and Y are like places like Mexico and Chile, or Mexico and Argentina, like basically non-Western. Like we're talking about any two countries. So just but it could be any countries. It doesn't have to be Western, right? So you have country X and you have country Y. How does trade work between country X and country Y? Well, so one relationship that's common is that X on net export more goods and services to Y than Y to X. So on net, X is exporting goods and services to X. But okay, but now Y is a receiver of goods and services by country X. But how does Y pay country X? Well, they pay, generally speaking, the international system or the international trading system is such that both of these countries, or goods and services, is going in one direction, but money or dollars is going in the other. So the dollar is going in the other. So, and so this is significant. That means that in any two countries in the globe, whenever there's goods and services being exchanged from one country to the other, one country receive goods and services, the other country on net receive money, dollars. That means that any two country means that the central bank in each of the country has to accumulate dollars in order to have international trade, since international trade is conducted in dollars, right? So this means that this means that the central bank of X and Y must accumulate dollars. Okay, so this means that if any two country must accumulate dollars in order for them to engage in international trade, where goods and services it goes in one direction and dollars goes in the other, that means that there is a huge demand for dollars. Basically liquidity. Dollar is a type of liquidity that allow any two countries to trade between them. They have to accumulate dollars. But this means that there is huge demand for the dollar. By the way, this idea that the central banks like around the world must hoard or accumulate dollars, this is one of the reasons why the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. Is a reserve currency. This is important. But the question is, if international trade is conducted using dollars, right? That means that central bank in any two countries must accumulate dollars. That means that there is a huge demand for the dollars. But how does the world get dollars in the first place? Well, in order to understand that relationship, we have to use the balance of payment equation. Consider the United States as one country, right? This is a country called the United States. Consider rest of the world. Of the world. How does the rest of the world accumulate dollars for international trade or liquidity for international trade? By the way, I will abbreviate it as from now on to be ROW, right? In order for US, remember US dollar is a sovereign currency so that US alone can print. So in order for US dollar to flow to the rest of the world, it must be the case the rest of the world has to export goods and services to the US. So the balance of payment equation in this dynamic is this: CA, the current account for the US, right, plus the financial account for the US has to be equal to 0. For the rest of the world, right, if for the rest of the world to have dollars, for the rest of the world to have dollars, to have dollars, right? US must run a trade deficit. That means that for the rest of the world to have dollars, the US current account must be negative, right? This means that this means this means that the financial account for US must be positive in order for this equation to balance, in order for the balance of payment equation to balance. So the dollar that allow international trade to happen, right, to grease the trade, comes at an expense that the United States have to have a perpetual trade deficit or current account, negative current account, but is compensated by a positive financial inflow, positive financial account. So take for example, if United States runs a negative current account, that means that the rest of the world, the rest of the world must run a positive capital account. So take capital account for ROW. Now, not all countries from the rest of the world runs a positive current account. Typically, in the real world, the countries that run the largest current account is China. So current account China, typically positive, right? Japan. All right. Oh, sorry. So the current account of Japan typically is bigger, is positive, right? Taiwan is another example. South Korea is another example. So we now have a relationship, right, where the accumulated current account for country I is equal to, so this is a summation of the current account of I, where I is all the countries in the rest of the world outside of the United States, has to be equals to the negative of the capital account of the US. Why is that? Oh, CA, US, this CA must be negative, right? So it's going to be positive. But we know from the balance of payment equation that this is identical to FA, the financial account of the US. And it has to be positive, right? Where I is any individual country from the rest of the world outside of the United States. So all of the world's current account, if you sum all of the world's current account, it must be equals to the negative of the current account of the United States, which is also equal to the US's financial account. So the Triffin's dilemma. There is this huge problem with this structure. One big concern for the structure is known as something called the Triffin's dilemma. And what it basically says is this: as the amount of, like, suppose that so the dilemma is this: the larger this outflow of dollars, right? So in order for international trade to work, United States have this perpetual, current account deficit. So that means that dollars is being leaked into the international system, right, for foreigners, right? That means that so the larger this outflow, the less confident people have of the dollar. Less confidence. Dollar. So this idea that there are more of something makes that thing worth less, thereby undermining the confidence of that currency, right? If there are more and more dollars being leaked into the international system, if foreigners have more and more dollars, then each dollar is worth less, right? Which undermine the confidence of the dollar as a currency. So mathematically, we can express this in the following way. The limit of, as time approaches infinity, the US external debt. That means that these are debts that are owned by foreigners. Basically, Chinese people, Japanese people buying US bonds or U.S. stocks, right? As time approaches infinity, the current account, the U.S. current account would go more and more negative, right? So foreigners will have to own more and more U.S. external debt. That means that this goes to infinity. But the problem with this is that this thing undermines the confidence of the dollar. And it's gonna fall to zero, right? The more dollars there are in the international system, the less each dollar is worth. And this is the Triffin's dilemma. That the first premise of the Triffin's dilemma is that the United States have to maintain a perpetual current account deficit. That means current account has to be negative, and second thesis is that as more dollars is being leaked into international system, foreigners are gonna be owning more and more of the U.S. financial assets. The United States foreigners will have more and more dollars, which undermine the confidence of the dollar, and as a as a as a safe haven for savings. And that's it.